Another useful live effect that you'll find inside of Illustrator's effect menu is something called warp. So let's take a look at how that applies. I'm going to use this warp effect file. Again, you can find this inside of chapter 14 of your exercise files. I'm going to go down to the bottom over here and select this text object. It reads surfing. I'm going to go to the effect menu. I'm going to choose warp. And then I'll choose one of these options. It really doesn't make a difference which one you choose because they all open up the same dialog box, and I could change between them later anyway. So I'm just going to choose the first one here called arc. Notice over here, there's this dialog box called warp options. And like I said before, all those are actually available here. In fact, I find this far more intuitive because all these items here have little icons on the far left that help you identify what each of these warp options do. As opposed to if I click cancel here and I go to the effect menu here, you'll see that these are just listed by their names. So you may have trouble understanding what each of these mean. But I'm going to go ahead and choose over here, and let's start off with arc, for example. Click on the preview button, and I can see that that simply warps that particular text that I've created. Now remember, as the same with all other live effects that you apply, the underlying vector graphics do not change. It just changes the appearance. So it looks as if that text is actually warped. Of course, it prints fine and everything else for that matter. But I can also adjust how much of that is arc. That's a little bit too much, I think. But if I go down to like 15%, that looks kind of cool. So as I start working with the warp effect, I see that very quickly I can get some of these little effects that are actually quite interesting. You can also choose horizontal and vertical distortion to see how that might look. But in this case here, with the text, you want it to be at least readable. That's the most important thing. It's got to look good, but you have to be able to read the word. So that's one option you have there for warp. So you can go through some of these and experiment with them. For example, there's the flag one. There's a whole bunch of them that are pretty much standard, and you can just choose between these of how much of a bend you want. What's great about the warp options live effect is that they abide by the rules of all the other live effects as well. What do I mean by that? Well, let me click OK to apply it to this text, but let's focus on this logo that I created up over here. If I click on this, you'll see that these objects are not grouped. They're all separate items. Now, when you go ahead and you apply any kind of an effect, I'm actually going to lock this background just so that doesn't get in the way. I'll go to Object and I'll choose Lock, and I'll just choose Lock Selection. That way I can marquee select things without that getting in the way. If I go ahead and I select all these, remember we discussed if we added a drop shadow without grouping this, then all the objects get a drop shadow inside of it. Well, the same thing applies to warping as well. If I don't group the elements together here in this logo, what will happen is if I go to the effect menu and I choose warp, and let's say I want to do some kind of a bulge or other kind of an effect, for example, let's go to preview. Take a look at what happens. Each of these particular elements are all kind of having that particular effect being applied to them on their own. So if I choose, let's say, for example, the bulge one, maybe we don't want the bulge, we want maybe the shell upper, maybe something like that, for example. Notice that over here, the word surf and the blue background and the red and the white are all being adjusted separately, which doesn't help me at all. If I really want to apply the effect to a whole bunch of objects together as if they were one, I need to create a group. And remember, when I do that, then I click on the group, Illustrator targets the group, and that means that the warp gets applied to the target, which is the group. So I'll cancel here, and with all these objects selected, I'll now hit Command-G or Control-G to create that group. Now when I go to the Effect menu and I choose Warp, and let's go ahead and choose that shell upper, for example. Now when I move this over here, and I click on the preview button, I see that everything gets treated the way that I'd like it to, as if it were one whole unit. So if you do want to apply the effects, and again, this really applies to all effects, be it 3D, be it the scribble effect, or any of the stylized effects, for example, and especially here with the warp effect, you want to make sure that if you wanted to apply it to multiple objects, you have to group those objects first, make sure the group is your target, then apply the effect as necessary.